attending, and good afternoon to everybody. I would like to start off by giving a little bit of background about British Standard 8580. Do your Legionella risk assessments comply? This was devised to try and make the document a little bit more hand in glove, and rather than having a very large document detailing when the first Legionella outbreak was, or when the first Legionella outbreak in the UK occurred, or all of the other legislative documentation and statute rubbish that we say rubbish, key information that we see on a regular basis. We don't necessarily need to have that within the document. So this document is there to try and make it a little bit more hand in glove and a little bit more user friendly for the people who are actually performing the risk assessment, and also the people who are actually reading the risk assessment. Okay, so what I'll do is just move you guys a little bit further that way. And thank you for allowing me to talk about risk assessments and British Standard 8580. Why am I talking to you about it? It's as I said, I've been in the industry for 25 years. I'm a chemist by trade, and we've come across Legionella risk assessments in very multiple shapes and formats. And there was no real British standard to comply to, and this was the document that was devised in 2019 to try and hopefully make that happen. And the starting point for any sort of risk management is, if there is a risk, we have a risk assessment. We assess that risk, and there's a number of organisations within the LCA organisation system, the Legionella Control Association, that we can choose from, and there's very few of those organisations that have actually UCAS accredited risk assessments, and the Water Hygiene Centre is one of those organisations that have that UCAS accreditation. Okay. So, Legionella risk assessments, why are they needed? British Standard 8580, what does it include? And do your risk assessments comply? And what are the key points to take away? So that's the fundamentals of the presentation today. And the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 require employers to put in place arrangements to control health and safety risks. And as a minimum, you should have the processes and procedures required to meet the legal requirements. And these include a written policy. These include an assessment of the risks to employees, contractors, customers, partners, and any other people who could be affected by your activities, such as the surrounding public. And if you employ 5 or more people, it's a requirement, and any risk assessment must be suitable and sufficient. And arrangements for the effective planning, organisation, control, monitoring, and reviewing of the preventative and protective measures that come from risk assessments must also be applied. We should have access to competent health and safety advice, and that can be people within your own organisation. It could be a trusted advisor, it could be an experienced risk assessor, or it could be a water treatment organisation. We should provide employees with information about the risks in your workplace and how they are protected. Instruction and training for employees in how to deal with the risks. We should ensure that there is adequate and appropriate supervision in place, consulting with employees about their risks at work and current preventative and protective measures, for example. So this is all good stuff. And as you can see, that information is readily available from the Health and Safety Made Simple on the HC government website. Worth downloading, and it's just the basics for your business. So what we do is we do an assessment of that risk, and we undertake the hierarchy of controls. Well, we know that we can't eliminate water, we can't substitute water, but what we can do is the following: we can engineer best practice, we can engineer out the risks associated with water hygiene management. And we assess the risks to health arising from hazardous substances used in or created by your workplace activities. We decide what precautions are needed, and you must not carry out work which could expose your employees to hazardous substances without first considering the risks and the necessary precautions. And what else do you need to comply with IOSH? We prevent or adequately control exposure. You must prevent your employees being exposed to hazardous substances. Where preventing exposure is not reasonably practicable, then you must adequately control it. And we should ensure that control measures are used and maintained properly, and that safety procedures are followed. And we monitor the exposure of employees to hazardous substances if necessary. We also carry out appropriate health surveillance where your assessment has shown this is necessary or where IOSH sets specific requirements. We prepare plans and procedures to deal with accidents, incidents, and emergencies involving hazardous substances where necessary, and we ensure employees are properly informed, trained, and supervised. And again, that's just the documentation that we're all aware of. And as I mentioned, the hierarchy of controls, we can't eliminate, we can't substitute, we can engineer, we can control, and I suppose we could give people PPE, but who's going to provide all employees, visitors, guests, contractors, and surrounding population with P3 masks that can remove less than 5 micron aerosols from being inhaled? So the two areas that we can actually help with or manage waterborne pathogens are predominantly engineer and control. So we want to engineer the risks out in regarding to stored water, waters within the right temperature, excessive amounts of nutrients, scale deposition, etc., etc. And these are all things that we can help engineer, but then also we can control by making sure we have the adequate temperatures, we do cleans and disinfections, we perform the right methodologies and monitoring and maintenance. So we've got a document, and behind these documents is that there's the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, which tells us that we've got to keep our visitors, guests, surrounding public, people safe. We've got to keep people safe within the workplace and surrounding areas. And then we've got the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations of 1999. We've also got IOSH, and none of those documents tell us exactly how to manage the control of Legionella bacteria water systems. And we've got a document called the Approved Code of Practice. And that Approved Code of Practice is not quite a law, but it's also not quite guidance. It's got a quasi-legal, special legal status, quasi-legal status. And it's a requirement to have a suitable and sufficient risk assessment completed. And the risk assessment must be completed by a competent person. Okay, and then we've got a little bit of narrative about what we define as a competent person. Competent person isn't necessarily somebody who has just been trained, because we may well have trained them, but they didn't listen. So that person's got to be trained. They've got to show that they've got understanding of the subject. They've got to be assessed for suitability. They've got to have competency in the area of that business sector that we're working within, or that risk assessment's been undertaken within. And for example, it's not a good idea to send somebody who's only ever done domestic dwellings to, let's say, a power station or a hospital, where those things are increasing the potential risks with the clientele, but also the systems and the processes that are in use. Okay, so why are they needed? Okay, so the HSE have defined 4 areas where a risk assessment is deemed to be necessary. And those are cooling systems with cooling towers, evaporative condensers, or dry wet cooling systems. The hot and cold water systems, so domestic systems, sorts of things, not just domestic dwellings, but domestic systems, hot and cold water systems within industry sectors or care or any other sector. Spa pools have got their own specific documentation guidance. And then we've got other plant and systems containing water that can create and increase the risk from Legionella during operation or when being maintained. And that's basically any other system. So any other system that could produce an aerosol or where water surface tension is broken needs to have its own risk assessment and management plan if required. So that there, basically those 4 items cover a whole multitude of sins. And we've also got a low risk, so apologies, we've also got a definition of a low risk system. So lots and lots of people say, well, I've only got a low risk system, there's not many people involved, I've only got water supplying to fit and healthy people, individuals, etc., and we turn over the water on a regular basis. That still needs to have a risk assessment, and the management program on the back of that risk assessment may well be minimal, but it needs to have a risk assessment to identify the risk. And some of the examples of what a low risk system is a small building without people especially at risk from Legionella bacteria, where daily water usage is inevitable and sufficient to turn over the entire system, or where cold water comes directly from a Holton main supply, no stored water tanks, for example, or where hot water is fed from instantaneous heaters or low storage volume water heaters supplying outlets at greater than 50 degrees C, and where the only outlets are toilets and hand wash basins, no showers. Now, as I said, they're deemed as low risk systems. Anything above that increases the risk proportionally. So is there really a Legionella risk? Okay, and this data stops at 2019. And the reason being is because we had other fish to fry during the 2020, 21, 22 period. And the information wasn't readily available in order for us to continue with these graphical slides. We have started to gain that data again, and that data is being produced by NOIDS, which is a part of the Public Health England. But that information again isn't quite matching what the information was available before COVID, if that makes sense. So during the COVID years, we didn't really have any records being kept on what was a Legionella case. So hence the reason why the figures stop at 2019. And as we can tell, during the summer months, there's a greater number of cases. And that's what you expect from a temperature perspective, from a holiday perspective, potentially. And I'm just wondering, quick question. This isn't this is a rhetorical question, but when was the last time we all heard about Legionella bacteria in the general domain in the press? And the last time I remember it was Bibi Stockholm, where we had the boat, and unfortunately that boat contained Legionella bacteria, and we had to cease usage of that boat for a period of time. And that was the last time I remember Legionella being in the press. But there has been some serious outbreaks. There was a couple of deaths in Stoke-on-Trent at Fenton at a warehouse or a district JTF it was called, and there was 2 people that died by inhaling an aerosol from a demonstration spa pool. And there was obviously a large outbreak in the Netherlands in 2012 as well at a flower show, again spa pool demonstration. Obviously, there was a 2002 outbreak in Barrow where I was involved, and unfortunately I was involved, but it was nothing to do with me nor the organisation I was representing at the time. And then there's 2012, which was the Edinburgh outbreak. But there's been lots and lots of smaller cases, but it's not always in the press, and that's a good thing that it's not always in the press. But it also means that we don't always know about it. And one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, how many people do you actually think understand and know about Legionnaire's disease? And I clutch at a figure thinking hopefully maybe 10% of the population understand it and know about it, but the figure may be a lot lower than that. And again, it's because it's not necessarily in the press. It's got a mortality rate of 12%, so we know that the risk associated with the contraction of it is relatively low. So the risk associated with contracting Legionnaire's disease is relatively low, but the consequence is quite high. It's got a 12% fatality rate. So we do need to make sure that these things are under control. And as you can see, that every month we identify a Legionnaire's disease case or confirmed case. We've also got the Approved Code of Practice L8 and HSG 274. They don't actually tell you how to complete the risk assessment. They detail the need to have a suitable and sufficient assessment completed by a competent person. So we've got this British Standard document here, and it identifies several areas that should be taken into consideration. And these are things like the competency of the risk assessor, the independence, the desktop appraisal of documentation, the site survey. It's the appraisal of the current scheme of control. How do we actually manage it? Who are the people that are going to be impacted with the risk? Evaluation of the risks, risk rating systems. Is there a risk assessment reporting tool? How did we identify those risks? And what are the control measures that we need to implement to try and reduce that risk or control or help manage that risk? And over the next few slides, we're going to detail a little bit more about a couple of those areas. And the factors to be considered in the risk assessment are a chain of events leading to the infection of a human by Legionella. And that should be the contamination of the actual water source, the amplification, the transmission of it, the exposure of whom, and the susceptibility of the individuals exposed. And as I just detailed, this isn't a condition survey. This isn't just a walk around to say you've got a tank. You've got to take a lot of these factors into consideration. How we're managing it. What's the risk associated with each individual? It's not necessarily just a condition survey. And we need to look at each of these parts of the risk assessment process. So from a contamination perspective, Legionella is a naturally occurring organism that can be found in low concentrations in mains water. How can a water system be contaminated, colonized? Have we got the right nutrients? The contamination through low flow, no flow areas, such as biofilm. The growth of Legionella within the water system. We need somewhere warm to live and food. Same is true with Legionella. And then the transmission of it. Water that contains Legionella, how is it transmitted to a human? Through inhalation or aspiration, breathing in small droplets of water. Indoor sprays of water from outlets or devices, and outdoor from larger devices such as cooling towers or water features. It can travel 100 meters, kilometers. There's a study out at the moment that's suggesting that water aerosols can travel up to 5 miles. And that's increased over the last 20 years due to the suspicion that we've got cleaner air, we've got less pollution, so therefore the aerosols can travel further. As I say, there's a white paper created in the USA that's detailing that information. And then from an exposure perspective, the closer to the source, the more likelihood that we are exposed to the atomized water, such as a spa pool, for example. And then finally, and this is probably one of the most important parts, the susceptibility of the individual. More are susceptible than others, but these need to be considered. And that consideration is such as, let's take, for example, the susceptibility of people within a school, college, or university compared to the susceptibility of people within a cancer care centre. And the risk can't be the same, or the susceptibility isn't the same. And that's got to be taken into consideration. And the competency of the risk assessor is paramount. And as I mentioned before, that risk assessor has got to have some industry knowledge of your industry sector or knowledge of your industry sector. It's got certain criteria, certain pinch points, certain operating characteristics of certain things have got to be taken into consideration, such as the operation of how a power station functions, of the risk associated to a induced draft hyperbolic cooling system compared to a evaporative condenser, for example. And again, the susceptibility of the surrounding areas. What is the likelihood of the monitoring, the program, the management program, the maintenance program? They have all got to be understood and appreciated by the person performing the risk assessment. It's up to the duty holder to ensure that the person who carries out the risk assessment and provides advice on prevention and control of that exposure must be competent to do so. So it's detailed within and emphasised within the L8 document, the approved code of practice. And that duty holder must ensure that the person who carries out the risk assessment provides advice, control of exposure must be competent to do so. They must be certificate of accreditation, Legionella control associated, etc., etc. That all gives credibility. And the LCA is a membership scheme which the agency detail in ACOP and HSG 274 as a possible source for support. And that condition survey that I mentioned earlier, it's not just a look at the water systems, take some temperatures and notes on the status of condition. Is it functioning? Yes. Does it deliver water at this? This is not a risk assessment, or this is not deemed to be a risk assessment anymore. In order to assess the risk, you need to consider how the risk is currently being managed. So we appraise the current scheme of control. We appraise the maintenance and testing records. We appraise the management responsibilities, who's doing what, where, when, why, and how. We appraise the training records and competency checks. We make sure that the people actually doing the work are competent to a degree and to the right degree. And then we appraise the safe operation of the system, and then we appraise the monitoring and the inspection records. And before looking around the building at the water systems, there is a need to look at all of these systems in its entirety from a management perspective. And this really gives us the understanding and the knowledge that that system is being managed correctly. And for example, if the RP, the responsible person, hasn't had training, how good is their knowledge and understanding of what is required? And how good is that information being transferred further down to the competent people who are using the equipment, to the people who are actually taking the checks, doing the checks, and making sure that those systems are being managed correctly. And that lack of training can cascade down and can be reflected upon how we actually manage that system. And after the desktop appraisal, there is a need to look at the risk systems within the property. And this actually requires the assessor to look at the current asset list and visit the item, device, system, and assess it. And this isn't a drive-by. This isn't just a little look through the window and a peek at the system to say, yeah, it's got a hot and cold water system. It's not a courtesy look at the system. It is a branch and root analysis of a management, but also how that system is being run, and again, like I say, being managed. Managed is the biggest part of it. If we manage things, what gets managed gets done, and that is the key phrase, I suppose. It's not a cut and paste approach to a risk assessment. We've done it before, so it's just a quick look, and it really does require people to pay a bit of attention to both the management aspect of it, but also to the actual system. Any changes? Has there been any changes to documentation? Any updates to whether we use a flow-through pressure vessel or distribution systems or supplementary measure changes, etc., etc. Okay, so I think we can probably all agree that the best opportunity to control Legionella is through temperature. Keep the hot hot, the cold cold, keep it all moving, keep it clean, and keep it well managed. And those are the things that we ought to be thinking about every time we look at a system. And the person completing the routine checks, have they been trained? There are different types of thermometers, for example. There are immersion, contact, dual gauges on vessels, dual probes gauges on vessels, BMS systems. Do they know how to use them correctly and where to record the data? Were the probes calibrated? When was the last time the temperature probe was calibrated? When was the last time we calibrated a gauge on a vessel, for example? And how reliable is this data? And this data is providing evidence on the state of compliance. If it's not right, then false assurances is being provided. And where there is doubt about the efficacy of the thermometer from a desk-based appraisal, the risk assessor would be inclined to take more temperature readings to test the system to see if it is compliant or not. And then we've got, again, this section here, which is a common area that people undertake as part of their risk assessment process. Testing for Legionella is not a prerequisite for a Legionella risk assessment. They are often included as extra add-ons, which is fine if that's what you want to pay for. But as I say, testing for Legionella is not a prerequisite for a Legionella risk assessment. And British Standard 8502 details clearly when a sample might want to be taken as part of that risk assessment. And British Standard 7592 details how to take a Legionella sample, whether it be pre and post need and the technique. And that is key. We also need to get it sampled and analysed at a UCAS accredited laboratory to the right ISO. So LA and British Standard 8580, they don't detail a scoring method, but a scoring method is required. British Standard 8502 details the need for a scoring matrix to be defined and included in the risk assessment. And that risk should not just be defined by the highest risk issue. That risk needs to consider the contamination, amplification, transmission, and exposure. And as touched on earlier, the susceptibility of occupants needs to be considered as such. This will impact on the risk rating. And the report should be clear and concise. It shouldn't be pages and pages and pages of repeating guidance and history of Legionella, as I mentioned earlier. And the action plan, the risk minimisation scheme, needs to include a priority status for the recommendations. And the deadlines for the prioritised actions need to be agreed by the responsible person, the water safety group, whether it be in a hospital or a non-NHS site. We'd have key individuals who are looking at those risks, and then that has an impact on your appetite for risk, and it also takes into consideration what your plans are for the future of that piece of equipment, whether it be a cooling tower that may well be coming offline in 2 years, or whether you decide to change the plumbing system within the facility or a refurbishment. The risk rating details the identification of the priority, but then the decisions on that priority need to be agreed by the relevant parties within the organisation. And again, that goes back to your appetite for risk and how you manage and control and what the availability is of actions. Having completed a broad overview of what the British Standard 8580 requires from a risk assessment, some of the items discussed will or may already have the mind racing. And it would be worth looking at the content of British Standard 8580 and completing a check or tick box to see if you comply. And this document is, as I said, a good opportunity to say, do we do these things? Do we not do these things? Which ones are the areas that we probably need to improve on? And worth checking out. Okay, so apologies, from today, we've got key points to take away. Legionella risk assessments are a requirement of regulations and guidance. Guidance details what needs to be assessed. It doesn't tell you how to assess them, it just tells you what needs to be assessed. And that goes back to cooling towers, hot and cold water systems, spa pools, and any other risk system that may have a risk associated to it, whether it's being worked on or in operation. And that could be a whole multitude of things. And some of the things that we come across on a day-to-day basis are car washers, deluge systems, fire suppression systems, sprinkler systems. They could be what we used to have at Morrison's Superstore, which was an aerosol being generated over their fruit and veg section, and there was a risk associated to it, and they were therefore removed from it. But we come across aerosols more than we think and more than we probably know. But those types of systems from an industry sector, from plant maintenance, from water features, etc., they all need to be risk assessed because water surface tension is being broken and there is a risk associated to that. The risk may well be minimal and there might not be a further action plan needed. And if so, that's great. As long as it's been recorded within the risk assessment, that's fine. We've also got a document there, British Standard 8580, details the approach for undertaking a Legionella risk assessment, what it should include, etc., and that tick box exercise, which I do recommend that you have a look through. Legionella risk assessments, which meet the requirement of British Standard 8580. Look to the LCA membership. There's greater than 300 members who can complete a Legionella risk assessment. And then for further sort of filtration system, you can look at to UCAS accreditation. Only 13 companies, I think it's now 14 in the UK, are accredited to Legionella risk assessments. And then finally, Legionella risk assessments need to be completed by a competent individual who is independent from vested interest. And what we mean by that is let's get somebody who can police the person who's doing the work. So an independent risk assessment organization that can show independence, but also has got no vested interest in any further works from that point, if that makes sense. And that is a key area for, again, monitoring and managing the organization who's currently undertaking your maintenance program. If you've got one, you may well do it in-house. Okay, and that is almost the end of my presentation. We've got LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter. We've got some academy videos to tell you how to do temperature monitoring, Legionella sampling, flushing little used outlets. Again, we've got a barcode there which we can scan to receive blogs. And the blogs are predominantly non-salesy, and this is more from an educational perspective. So the more people, as I mentioned earlier, I hope that 10% of the population know and understand Legionella bacteria to some degree. And what I would like is to try and improve that and increase the knowledge of and awareness of it. And to do that, we've thought about how we can do that, and that is by sending blogs out, which are predominantly educational blogs, in particular from clients or customers who've had specific issues. And we've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of blogs in on our website that may well be of interest, and feel free to follow us. And I think that is me done. Quite a quick one there, so I'll rattle through a couple of slides there, I'm sure, but hopefully it was all understood. I'm going to pass back to Nat then.
Excellent, thank you. So thank you for that, Peter. I've just put in the chat box if anybody's got any questions, if they want to put it in there. And we'll see what comes through.
Perfect. Shall I stop sharing, or does anybody want? Shall we have the slide still up? I'll leave it up. Bit of shameless self-promoting.
Yeah, definitely. So Richard Roper has basically put in and said, what about the requirement for a written scheme?
Fabulous question. So, yeah, absolutely, Richard. Lots and lots of organisations say that the risk assessment incorporates the written scheme. Unfortunately, lots and lots of risk assessments don't. And the written scheme is a separate document to the risk assessment. Sorry, did I say the written scheme is a separate document to the risk assessment? The risk assessment identifies the risk. The written scheme then details who's doing what, where, when, why, and how. And it incorporates schematic documents, it incorporates records, it incorporates competency matrices, it incorporates incident plans, it incorporates who is doing what and how the management of that system is being managed on an ongoing basis. So it details who's responsible, it puts names, job roles, lines of communication in there, and that the written scheme is the Bible, is your Bible, to ensure that you are managing that risk that has been identified by the risk assessment in a way that is helping control the risk to any individual. Does that make sense, Richard? Okay. Now, I've only got one question.
Yeah, I've only got one question here. If anybody else has got any questions, then please pop them in the chat. And Richard has given a thumbs up, looks like.
Cool.
Good question from Jennifer. What is the UCAS accreditation we should be looking for?
11720. ISO 11720.
There we go. And Ben details, should sampling form a part of control within the written scheme?
Okay, another great question. So if we are managing our systems through temperature and we are managing them adequately through temperature, we can prove that the hot is hot, the cold is cold, and we've got no risk, and that all pieces of equipment are working correctly, then there is no need to take samples, because if the temperatures are correct, we would therefore have a dormant Legionella bacteria if less than 20, and we would have a dead bacteria if stored above 60 and delivered above 50 in the timeframes and returned above 50. So if we are controlling temperature and the whole process is being managed through temperature adequately, there is no reason for sampling in any way, shape, or form. It is good practice, don't get me wrong. If you're doing it, I don't suggest you stop, because it's good practice to prove that your system is under control. But throughout the documentation, unless there is a risk identified or a malfunctioning piece of equipment or a risk associated to it, then there's no sample requirements. Okay. If you have contractors managing Legionella for you, can you recommend what sort of checks you should be conducting? Competencies so ask for competency matrices of the individuals performing the tasks, and that's not just training matrices. So everybody, we often see training matrix being supplied as a competency matrix. They are different things. As I said before, just because you've been trained on something doesn't necessarily mean that you understood it. We've got to show that we've got competency. We've got to show that we've actually performed the work adequately. We can actually perform the tests undertaken to the right British standard. So competency of the individuals involved would be my first one.
Excellent. And Mark details, how often should risk assessments take place, and should they be reviewed? Well, I suppose it all depends on the premises and what changes and what equipment's in there.
Absolutely. We used to have a time frame. So every 2 years, irrespective of whether anything had changed, there was a written in the documentation that every 2 years we have a risk assessment review. That got removed, and the risk associated to the system now is on any changes to the system, any changes to the use of the building, if any further documentation has been released, if there's changes in key personnel, or if there's been a suspicion of an outbreak. So there's 5 or 6 criteria that identify when a water risk assessment should be undertaken. I don't recommend that we go for 10 years or something like that, but I do recommend that we could potentially go for 3 to 5 years, depending on the type of system we've got.
Excellent, thank you. They're rattling in now. So Anne-Marie says, I work at a small children's home that have very low risks. The types of control I'm guessing would be temperature checks, cleaning of showers. Am I on the right path?
Yes, you are. With children, we've probably got TMVs on there, thermostatic mixing valves. So those would need to be checked on a regular basis, 6 monthly for a fail-safe and annually for a strip down, depending on the manufacturer's details. You're looking at hot, cold temperature checks, hot temperature checks, flow into the TMV and flow out of the TMV, make sure it's between the designated temperatures of 38 and 43, I think it is. And yeah, those things should be checked on a regular basis, but you are on the right path.
Excellent. Russell asks, in schools, we ensure delivery at around about 43, not 50, aware of storage above 60, with return on cover for above 50, but do cooler than 50 delivery matter. So,
Yeah, it sounds to me as though you may well have TMVs. So you may mix the water to that 43 degrees C, and your flow to that TMV would probably be greater than 50. Worth checking, but most schools have got a lower appetite for risk from a scalding perspective.
excellent. Carl says, what key things would somebody be looking at when choosing a LRA provider in terms of training and demonstration of competence, similar to the other question we had earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, it's just the competency matrices. So it's when were they last assessed? When were they last peer reviewed? When was it proven that they could actually undertake that task adequately and deemed as being competent? There's a massive difference between a training matrix and a competency matrix, but the LCA strive on that competency matrix. So any organization that's providing you a service should be able to give you a competency matrix.
Excellent. Ian asks, can you give some examples, more examples of what you mean by water surface tension being broken? Because we tend to think of aerosols and vaporizing water, for example, showers, as primary risks. So what about things like jet washers and things like that?
Yeah, just the things that I mentioned there at the end, really. So fire suppression system, wet fire suppression systems, when they're being tested, is an aerosol being produced. And where, so deluge systems, fire sprinkler systems. We've all been to, I'm pretty sure we've all seen a football match or a sports event where there's been some aerosols being produced from water in the pitch. I'm getting a little bit older in life, and I'm going to garden centres where there are irrigation systems. That's water surface tension is broken. I've been to foreign lands relatively recently and walked into a beer garden with aerosols being produced because it's a cooling mist. Alton Towers, Blackpool Pleasure Beach, Drayton Manor, all of areas where water surface tension is being broken and we probably don't think about it. Process systems is predominantly and also an industrial process systems. So suppression systems, but also last thing now, odor suppression systems and aerosols being produced there. We've got paint spray booths where there's a water mopping up the excess paint. Lots of things. Does that make any sense at all with that answer?
Certainly did. Certainly did. Hopefully, Ian is happy with that response. Nicola asks, are there any recommendations other than additional flushing when the incoming water from the supply is greater than 20 degrees?
Great question. The incoming supply from the supplier is now often greater than 20 degrees, which they could supply us with, if I remember correctly, it was up to 25 degrees C. I now believe that's been moved or removed from their supply requirements. Flushing is the main way to manage it. If you are receiving greater than 20 degrees centigrade water, you're not going to have much control of it whilst on the premises, apart from flushing. You could chill, but there's a cost associated with that. And yeah, chilling is an option.
Excellent, thank you. Pamela says, is there a level of competency required to write the actual scheme of control?
Great question. An understanding of the management of it, no, not necessarily. But a quite a robust document needs to be produced. There's not necessarily a competency required to writing one. You can write one, anybody can write one, but they've got to know, they've got to understand what they're actually writing. That's the only level of competency that I would suggest.
Excellent. Vicky asks, our landlord is responsible for testing for the Legionella. Other than asking for their risk assessment and regular results of the testing, is there anything else we should be including in our risk assessment?
Sampling, regular tests of results of testing. So is your when was the last clean disinfection? If there's tanks, what's the clarity photographs? So we normally, organizations who perform remedial works take a pre and post photograph of the condition of things. Your risk assessment should identify and should have photographs in there detailing specific things that you've got. You may well want to look at when the last time these items were maintained or cleaned or disinfected.
Excellent. And probably about the competency of the contractors as well.
Good point. I've waited on for that so long.
Yeah, it's ingrained in us now. So there we go. Alexis says, reference premises with TMVs. Can people be reminded of where to test? Because I frequently find they are checking after the valve and not before it. I
wish they would all be reminded of where to test. Yeah, that's again a competency assessment of the person doing the testing, because they're unaware of what the system layout is and what equipment is on site. So that's a lack of training and competency of the person doing the test of the outlets.
Excellent. David asks, in a housing setting, I understand good practice is to conduct risk assessments and schematics for property archetypes. Other than water temperature control, blind end, dead leg removal, and system clean, is there anything that would be different or should be considered for purely domestic premises?
Yeah, it's a great point and a spot-on definition of blind end, dead legs. I like that. And yes, I believe that from a contractual obligation, there should be a recommendation that somebody should be performing regular cleans and disinfections of the shower head and hose on a quarterly basis, if that's frequent enough. If the scaling potential of those shower heads and hoses, then it should be more frequently. I think the temperatures should also be stored at 60 degrees C and delivered at 50 degrees C. Obviously, you've got some scalding issues and whatnot there, but things like that should, in my opinion, be identified within the contract. And this is dependent on whether it's a large organization with housing, or whether this is a landlorded property. I'm hoping, David, that made a little bit of sense in your world.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to take the last three questions then. So Ben has asked, do flexi hose fittings to filling loops, etc., increase the risk of increased Legionella bacteria? Yeah, flexi hoses have been a questionable item over the last few years, and that's because a study was done on them from removing them, opening them up, looking at the internals of these flexible hoses and swabbing those flexible hoses. And the internals of the flexible hose is rubber, and rubber is a fantastic organic material where biofilm likes to form because it's porous. It's got all these holes, nooks, crevices, etc. And this is where bacteria likes to form. And a number of NHS trusts have decided to remove all flexible hoses because it does increase the risk of Legionella bacteria. And this is a recommendation that they get hard plumbed in. So where possible, could be hard plumbing from, for example, or could be regularly
could we regularly exchange the flexible hoses out? Those are the options. And that's not just filling loops, but that's from supplying sinks, basins, etc., etc., etc.
Excellent. Thank you. Terry asks, with the current energy cost issues, would you have any recommendations regarding varying storage temperatures during a 24-hour turnover period?
Terry, I'm going to take the fifth, and I'm going to say no.
There we go.
I unfortunately cannot suggest that we reduce the temperatures.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts, but in a public forum, unfortunately, Terry, no.
There we go. Francis asks, what are the risks from mains-fed electric shower, and what controls should be in place, please?
Yeah, the risk isn't as great from a mains fed electric shower, but there is still a risk, unfortunately. The shower head and hose is still to be incorporated within that quarterly disinfection, cleaning disinfection process.
Excellent. And last question now from Karen, which says, if you have borehole water rather than mains water, do you have any suggestions on what can be done to prevent Legionella issues with such organism-rich water?
Yeah. Okay, super stuff. Yeah, borehole water, great. It's via the aquifer. Yes, it can be full of certain things. It can be full of different types of ions, minerals, magnesium, for example, manganese. Filtration systems are often good. UV disinfection systems are often good. We can dose chlorine into there. There are lots of opportunities or lots of options available to you on a borehole, and some are relatively simple. And my suggestion would be that we go to a filtration system and a UV disinfection system, which again is quite straightforward and just continues to work like your UV disinfection in a pond, for example. As long as the water goes through there and it's removing some of the organics, the suspended solids, it will allow the UV light to go through and hit the organisms rather than the suspended solids within there. So we've got to filter it first and then UV would be my suggestion.
Excellent. And one final one that came in quickly from Marsha, but I think it all depends on how it's being used. If you have a fire hose, do you recommend test for Legionella?
No, not necessarily, Marsha, but it does need to be tested that it can be functioned. And when it's being tested, we need to protect the people who are doing the tests or going to be exposed to the potential aerosol, because we know that they are they're stagnant, but they've got to be working. And if we are testing them on a regular basis, the person who is exposed to the aerosols during the test, or the people who are exposed to the aerosols during the test, need to be protected as best possible. So maybe we give them a mask. We ensure that the aerosols being produced aren't the people who are doing it aren't exposed to a large volume of aerosols. So methodology and how we go about testing it maybe need to discussed.
Excellent, thank you. Sorry, one just flew in now, talking about water storage outside in water butts, such as rainwater harvesting, which remain full for long periods before using. Do people consider this an issue?
Now, that's a great question, because from the water process, from the water cycle, the evaporation of water does not contain Legionella bacteria. That water then is precipitated and arrives into our mains water butts. Shouldn't have Legionella bacteria in there, but we know that it can have. So and other organic material and other bacteriological material, or other bacteria are within them. And as you say, they remain full for long periods of time. Do people consider this an issue? I do. Lots of people don't. However, lots of people don't foresee compost as being an issue either. But unfortunately, 2 people in Scotland passed contracting Legionella disease from compost. So there's lots and lots of places where some people don't think it's a problem, but it can be.
Excellent. Thank you, Peter. I'm going to share my screen here. Thank you very much for answering that. So yes, thank you very much, Peter, from the Water Hygiene Centre. I always find the Q&A really interesting. People get to talk about what they're dealing with day to day. So yeah, thank you very much for that, and really hope you've enjoyed your session. Basically, yeah, we'd like to welcome you to our future meetings, and hopefully you all took down the details of the Water Hygiene Centre and all the resources that they offer. We have a feedback post or pop-up. So once the meeting will finish, it will ask you to fill out how well you found the session today, and whether you have any ideas for any future sessions as well. Yeah. I'd just like to say thank you very much for everybody. If you've got any more information, want to send us some info, then please email us. Peter, anything to add before we go?
No, but thank you very much for the questions. I really appreciate the engagement, and hopefully we found it useful.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We'll now end the session. And once again, just like to thank Peter from the Water Hygiene Centre, and have a very good afternoon. Bye now.
Perfect. Thanks, Ness. Thanks very much.
Bye.